It's all fake. It's all just to get the United States to convince Israel not to do anything in Lebanon and not to go all the way in Gaza.
Palestine first, and the Iranians are a solution, not the source of the problem.
That is Iranian strategy in a nutshell. It's how to manipulate you, manipulate your values, manipulate your soul. There are three priorities. The first is Iran, the second is Iran, the third is Iran.
Welcome back to another episode of Israel Under Fire. I'm Dan Diker, president of the Jerusalem Center for Foreign Affairs. And today, the Iranian regime's shadow war is right in the sunlight with the April 14th direct attack on Israel from Tehran. We are more than delighted to have on the program today to create perspective and context on the Iranian-Israel war and the Iranian war on the West. We have Dr. Dave Wurmser, who's the former senior advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney on the Middle East and a former senior State Department official. Dave, great to have you on the program. How do you understand this latest dramatic development and the reaction within Iran, which did not actually blame Israel very uncharacteristically for this crash, and I would say probably an unprecedented tragedy, if you will, certainly against major regime officials.
First of all, the killing of the president and the foreign minister, who was the other official, main official, that was killed in this crash, was weather. I mean, it's very clear it was the weather. It was foggy. They navigated wrong, and they navigated into a mountain, apparently. Now, what happened in the Middle East is never what sort of is worked through. The first thing people thought was, and the way people think in the Middle East is who would be the most to gain from this if this happened, and they thought Israelis. So you started seeing the rumors running around, which RT TV, by the way, the Russians put forward, that the Israelis were behind it, and there were a lot of Iranian channels that were suggesting it. And they fell for some jokes even in the West, which is quite surprising. They were following the Israeli joke circuit, and they saw that the Israelis were joking that there was a Mossad agent helicopter that was the pilot, and it actually made it into some of the channels. It certainly made it into Hezbollah and Hamas's channels. But I don't think the regime wanted to go there this time. They could have said this is a conspiracy, and they could have invented one.
Because they're scared. I think, Dave, they're scared of an uptick in what might be Israel's reaction to that. I mean, they don't want a direct confrontation with Israel. That's what I understand.
That is correct. And what's so interesting about that is that it's essentially runs against what they did a month ago with their massive missile attack. They had already made this an overt hot war with Israel. And here they're pulling back. And I think that reflects the depth of their fear, especially that it's one thing to do missile attacks on Israel when you're ready because you're doing them. But in a government like this, which is based on terror and fear internally to survive, and their biggest concern, their biggest threat is always the internal. They're worried right now about an uprising or some sort of violence that they have to suppress. Anything in Iran until now, over the last 2-3 years, any small thing, an earthquake or so forth, has triggered huge unrest on the streets. So I think what's happening here is that the Iranian government doesn't want to add anything to their problems. If they say that the Israelis are behind it, then they look further weak. They look like the Israelis successfully did something horrible to them. And the government loses its credibility as an institution, as a powerful structure, and that could actually encourage street demonstrations. And that's why on the street there was an awful lot of rumoring about the Israelis, because they hoped it was. Because then they see the regime as vulnerable and so forth. So I don't think the regime particularly wanted, right at this moment, escalation with Israel, and rhetorically saying what they would have to say to blame Israel in a conspiracy. I think they're scared of that. In fact, I would read from that the Iranian regime for the next 3, 4, 5 weeks, as it weathers the immediate period of transition, is going to behave in a, quote, moderate way to some extent. It's all fake. It's all just to get the United States to convince Israel not to do anything in Lebanon and not to go all the way in Gaza. But that is probably what they'll do, because right now they're afraid of escalation.
90% of the Iranian public actually opposes the regime and either quietly and less quietly favors Israel. So by the Iranian regime fomenting this sort of deception and disinformation actually can work against them, because it's those same public, it's the same Iranian public at soccer games by the tens of thousands that are declaring, we don't want Palestine, we want, we're in it for the Iranian people. The regime knows that if they were to blame Israel falsely once again in their pre-planned, decades-long deception strategy, that it could just boomerang against the regime and actually create greater weakness.
Exactly. In a moment like this of transition, you don't want a foreign enemy to go on a rampage. And the last thing they want is to have Israel dig into them in any sort of a way while they're going through this transition. Again, Iranian regime has been remarkably consistent, regardless of who runs it, in its hatred of America and its hatred of Israel and its total war that it's waged on both. So nothing will change in that way, but they manipulate the West. And this administration in Washington, more likely than not, will buy any signals of moderation, even if temporary for 2 weeks, and turn to the Israelis and say, please just restrain yourself.
There you have it, Dave Wurmser's comment about deception warfare. In the next segment, we're going to talk about how the October 7th atrocities brought that to fruition in tricking the West, thinking this was part of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, when it really was a continuation of the war against the West. Stay with us. Welcome back to Israel Under Fire. I'm Dan Diker, and I'm delighted to be here with Dr. Dave Wurmser, former senior advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney on Iran and the Middle East. Right now, Dave Wurmser, we're going to talk about Iran's deception warfare as it played out and exploded on the October the 7th in the mass atrocities against Israel, which actually was no less a continuation of its war against the big Satan, in its own words, the United States. Help us understand the effective deception and disinformation on the October 7th mass murders against Israelis, which is really part of the greater war against the U.S.-led Western alliance.
Yeah, I think we descended fairly quickly after October 7th into a debate over whether Iran picked the timing and ordered it that moment, which was really irrelevant, because clearly what Iran was doing in building up Hamas and setting up these capabilities and arming Hamas, this was an Iranian plan from the start. So whether the timing was entirely in the hands of Iran or some of it was also in the hands of Hamas, it's a tactical question. It's not a strategic question. Iran was behind this attack. Now, why would they do it? Well, I think there was a number of things. That they were afraid of the Saudi Arabian rapprochement with Israel. And I think we have to remember that under the table, the Saudis and the Israelis were drawing quite close. I did not believe that there was going to be a peace treaty between Saudi Arabia and Israel before October 7th, largely not because of the conditions that the Saudis put forward, but because they had been treated very badly by the Biden administration in the early part of the Biden administration, so much so that they understood American behavior as an attempt to oust the royal family, or at least Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, of the royal family. And a peace treaty with Saudi Arabia and Israel is the crown jewel of peace treaties. The world boycott, etc., the skittishness of the Japanese, essentially it's an end of war scenario for and I'm talking about the Arab-Israeli war of 75 years, not the Gaza war of 7 months. it was really an end of war scenario. That's it. Biden is in an election cycle. The Saudis know it, and they would never have given this administration the gratitude or the satisfaction of having a peace treaty. The other thing is they didn't want to validate the fact that the Abraham Accords were not valid. The terms that the Washington was trying to bring up ever since the Bennett administration in Israel, a year into the Biden administration, they kept reinserting the Palestinian issue into the peace treaty. And that essentially meant that the Abraham Accords, it embarrasses the UAE. It makes them look like they jumped the gun and they didn't get what they should have gotten, which was a Palestinian peace treaty. On all levels, the Saudis did not want to validate the Biden administration or validate the Biden administration policies. So they were never going to sign a peace treaty until some future administration.
So what you're saying is the Iranian regime misread the U.S. Saudi relationship on this point.
Well, not entirely, because what was happening was that the Saudis and the Israelis didn't care that much about a formal peace treaty, and instead were deepening rapidly their under the table strategic relationship. And it's that strategic relationship that so terrified Tehran. So they wanted to show they wanted to derail that relationship, but more importantly, they wanted to show Israel as a weak, not as a strong horse, but as a lame donkey, essentially. Because in the region, that means nobody wants to sign a peace treaty with you. Peace treaties that exist go away. Weakness is truly a dangerous attribute to show in the region. So that's what they wanted to show. And then on the highest level, I think they understood the United States was hostile to Israel under the Biden administration. And as a result, they wanted to drive a wedge between the United States and Israel. I think that was their highest strategic goal.
And I think they've succeeded. I mean, I think they've succeeded in that strategy. And I think there's a point in that success, Dave Wurmser, that many in the American discussion have either overlooked or underemphasized, and that is that the Iranian regime understood how to exploit the Palestinian issue, which the Iranian regime itself would refuse under any scenario to help establish a Palestinian state, which is the sine qua non of Western policymaking today, would be a Palestinian state, which I think you and I know, and all the Israelis know, would constitute a strategic threat today. But from the Iranian regime point of view, they played it perfectly, because here they basically have cornered Israel on the Palestinian issue, opposite Israel's greatest ally, the United States, when Iran is now running towards the nuclear finish line, and also really establishing a nuclearizing type of supremacy in the Middle East.
The Palestinian issue is the main wedge that they use with the United States. They have consistently done that. They did it under when I was in the Bush administration, Bush 43, Vice President Cheney went to Riyadh. And at the time, we were beginning to go forward with the Annapolis Plan. Condoleezza Rice, at that time she was already Secretary of State, wanted to push forward on the Palestinian issue. The Saudis were so terrified because they knew the Palestinian issue was the Iranian entry point into sabotage. So they asked for Cheney to come to Riyadh, and their message in Riyadh was really very clear, which was, tell your Secretary of State there are three priorities. The first is Iran, the second is Iran, the third is Iran. Leave the Palestinian issue aside, because if you raise it publicly, we're forced into a corner, and then nothing good can come from that. You mentioned deceptive warfare, and one has to understand Iran is not impressed with relationships of power. It's not that they don't understand Israeli power, American power, but this is the nation of Sherazad. This is the nation where the central story, the national story, is that a woman who faced imminent execution, a woman who in that society is seen to be the symbol of weakness, is facing execution at the hands of her husband, which was the king, which is the symbol of absolute power. But she told stories, And the stories at first are the way many of us see it, is that buys time, buys time, buys time, and she saved herself. But if you buy time, eventually you're going to be executed anyway because you run out of stories or you get sick and you can't tell one. The purpose of the stories were to slowly manipulate the king, King Shahryar, to reawaken his soul in a way that Sherazade could manipulate. So much so that at the end of the cycle of stories, not only had she bought time, but she had taken control through manipulation of the king's soul. And she was the most powerful force in Persia. So here she went from the weakest to the most powerful. That is Iranian strategy in a nutshell. It's how to manipulate you, manipulate your values, manipulate your soul in order to gain power over you.
Dave Wurmser, this is such a critical point you make about manipulating the soul of a country, the soul of an alliance, and the cognitive ability of the world's greatest power, certainly in the free world, the United States, to actually believe that the Iranian regime is the solution, not the problem, that can only be solved through aggressive and assertive diplomacy with a real serious, credible military punch behind it. That's what we're going to talk about in our third and final segment with Dr. Dave Wurmser. How can the United States handle what Dave Wurmser calls this strategy of deception? Because right now, it is our view that the United States has it 180 degrees off, and that actually collides with America's vital interests in the Middle East. Stay with us. Welcome back to Israel Under Fire. I'm Dan Diker here with Dr. Dave Wurmser, and we're talking about Iran's deception strategy. How can the West re-engineer its understanding of Iran's deception, disinformation strategy that combines terror in hybrid warfare together with its longstanding strategy of taqiyya, or necessary deception, in order to take over the Middle East and ultimately the world, according to Iranian regime's own eschatology. Dave Wurmser, in your view as a former senior U.S. official, does the United States foreign policy establishment have it completely wrong in pushing the Palestinian issue because the Abraham Accords had broadened the strategic aperture of the conflict in the Middle East and the possible solution in the Middle East? And once again, here you have the United States basically saying it's what they call Palestine first, and the Iranians are a solution, not the source of the problem.
I think what the Abraham Accords showed us is that there were huge strategic things at work that were Central American interests. The establishment of a regional alliance aligned with the West anchors Western power at a time when the West is losing interest in the Middle East and losing energy to be abroad in such a large way. And if we are, we have a huge war in Europe, and we have a huge war potentially in Asia with China. So the United States does not want to spend a lot of time in the Middle East right now. So it needs a local alliance to pick up the pieces and carry the water for the West, which is exactly what the Iranians see. So for them, the Abraham Accords was the most dangerous thing. For the West, it should be the most important strategic goal. And for the people in the region, it should be the most important strategic goal, because otherwise they're alone against Iran, each individually, without American presence and at each other's throats. That's the real essence behind the Abraham Accords. And it certainly put the Palestinian issue as Palestinian issue last, because ultimately many solutions open up when you isolate the Palestinian problem from the geostrategic questions of the region. But when the Palestinian issue is part of the geostrategic issues in the region, and its, quote, solution is part of that, there's no solution. So they understood that in the Abraham countries, so they plowed ahead without resolving the Palestinian issue. The United States keeps pushing it forward, and it gives the Iranians the manipulative ability to essentially drive this wedge between the United States and Israel, and between Israel and the Arab countries, and between the United States, frankly, and Saudi Arabia and the UAE, because they don't want to have the Palestinian issue. So at the end of the day, I think the United States not only does not read Iran, but it literally falls into their trap.
So now, Dave, in the couple minutes we have left, what can be done in the American political discourse in order to change this strategic understanding of the problem? Because at this point, the Palestinian issue is so deeply engraved in the in the mind and the soul of American policymakers that it basically has isolated Israel as the Iranian regime and has empowered and legitimized the Iranian regime as if it were Israel of pre-1967.
Well, the administration's desire is to come to a condominium with Iran and then therefore calm the region down. You give Iran enough strategically, then it will calm down. It will see America not as its enemy, and it will have a sort of a regional strategic condominium with Iran, which of course is the exact opposite. The way to really deal with the Iranians is they are most afraid of Israeli power. They are most afraid of the American-Israeli relationship. They're most afraid of Arab countries encircling them, aligned with Israel in a powerful Israel. So I think it's the vital American interest right now to put the Palestinian issue aside, not talk about any solutions. The most important one is just some sort of an arrangement, not solutions. Number one. Number two, that Israel emerges from this war absolutely, unquestioningly a strong country, a powerful country, the anchor of Western interests in the region, and the Western anchor to the Israeli, to the Abraham Accords. So both with Lebanon and with the Palestinians, it is a vital American interest, I believe, a vital American interest to maintain our position in the region involves tremendous, stunning Israeli victory. And unfortunately, I think the policy of the Iranians of manipulating America into thinking that there's a regional condominium, if only you weaken Israel, you solve the Palestinian issue, which can only be done by weakening Israel, and not give Israel such a victory that it forces escalation on Iran. That is the Iranian manipulation of America. And unfortunately, this is the best manipulations manipulate something you're trending to do anyway.
Here we are. So Dave Wurmser, bottom line, the only choice for Israel is overwhelming and unconditional victory over the Hamas, because there are so many underlying reasons for that. It looks like we're going into a very, very hot war period opposite the Iranian proxy Hezbollah in the north, and to continue till victory, Israel's military victory, as well as a perceptual victory over Iran's Sunni proxy in the south, as we move forward in what is essentially a world war, World War III or World War IV. You choose your number. But Dr. Dave Wurmser, former senior official of the Bush 43, thank you ever so much for joining us on Israel Under Fire.